The morning air hung heavy over a Louisiana cotton field in 1857. Through the pre-dawn darkness, the crack of a whip echoed across the plantation like thunder, followed by a scream that would haunt witnesses for decades. What happened next would be documented in court records, medical journals, and the testimonies of survivors, evidence of a system so calculated in its cruelty that it defied human comprehension. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic torture, legally sanctioned and economically driven, designed to extract maximum labor while maintaining absolute control. The plantation punishment system represented one of history's most organized forms of institutional brutality, and its effects would echo through generations long after emancipation. But to understand how such horrors became routine, we must first examine the legal framework that made it all possible. The architecture of legal brutality. Virginia's 1705 Slave Code established a chilling precedent that would spread across the American South like a plague. The law declared that masters who killed slaves during correction could not be charged with felony, since it cannot be presumed that premeditated malice should induce any man to destroy his own estate. The logic was as simple as it was horrifying, but enslaved people were property first, humans second. South Carolina's 1740 Negro Act, enacted after the Stono Rebellion, sent shockwaves through the white establishment, codified even harsher measures. The law permitted corporal punishment other than death at judicial discretion and established 700-pound fines, not criminal penalties, for the willful murder of slaves. 700 pounds, the same amount paid for damaging someone's livestock. By 1857, Mississippi's legal code listed 25 capital offenses for enslaved people, while providing masters nearly unlimited punishment authority. The message was clear. The law existed to protect property owners, not the human beings they owned. Insurance companies documented slaves as property worth $300 to $1,200 each, requiring medical certificates of soundness that cataloged existing punishment injuries like wear and tear on farm equipment. Companies like Aetna insured individual enslaved people as capital investments, requiring maintenance rather than humans deserving protection. The economic logic was brutally simple. Punishment systems were designed to maximize labor extraction while maintaining enslaved people as valuable assets. Too little punishment meant reduced productivity. Too much meant damaged property. The system demanded a calculated cruelty that could break spirits without breaking bodies beyond repair. But what that looked like in practice was more horrific than any law could capture. The science of suffering. Frederick Douglass would never forget the sound that awakened him as a child on the Lloyd Plantation in Maryland. "I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine," he wrote, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. The instrument of this daily terror was the caddo, 9 tails, a large rope of many strands, the strands unraveled, and a knot tied at the extremity of each. Each strand was designed to tear flesh, creating multiple wounds with every blow. The psychological impact was as calculated as the physical damage. Solomon Northup, kidnapped into slavery for 12 years, documented the methodical nature of these beatings in his memoir. "With the paddle, Birch commenced beating me. Blow after blow was inflicted upon my naked body. When his unrelenting arm grew tired, he stopped and asked if I still insisted I was a free man." The famous Whipped Peter photograph from 1863 provides stark visual evidence of whipping's permanent effects, keloid scarring, covering an entire back, like a roadmap of suffering. Medical documentation from the period reveals infection rates of 60 to 80%, permanent nerve damage, and deliberate treatment designed to increase suffering rather than promote healing. Plantation physicians commonly treated wounds with salt brine, strong enough to hold up an egg, both to prevent infection and intensify pain. The Bennett Barrow diary from Louisiana meticulously recorded these sessions with chilling bureaucratic precision. April 27th. Whipped every hand in the field this evening, commencing with the driver. But whipping was just the beginning. For those who dared to resist or attempt escape, plantation owners had developed far more sophisticated methods of long-term torment, instruments of perpetual punishment. In the sweltering heat of a Georgia summer in 1846, a woman named Sarah stood in the plantation yard wearing an iron collar weighing 6 pounds. Spikes protruded inward, preventing her from lying down or leaning against any surface. Bells attached to the collar announced her every movement, ensuring she could never find a moment's peace or attempt to flee undetected. This was no medieval relic. $2, This was cutting-edge 19th century punishment technology designed specifically for the American plantation system. Margaret Nickerson, interviewed as part of the Works Progress Administration's slave narrative project in the 1930s, described the systematic application of these devices. Some of the slaves run away, lots of them. Some would be caught, and when they caught them, they put bells on them. First, they would put an iron band around the neck and another one around the waist and rivet them together down the back. The iron collars weren't just restraints. They were instruments of systematic torture. Medical accounts from the period document severe neck deformities, chronic infections at pressure points, respiratory complications, and complete psychological breakdown. The 2 to 6 pound weight caused continuous spinal pressure, while spiked versions created contact point infections that often proved fatal. The Henry Ford Museum and Bullock, Texas State History Museum preserve original examples of these devices today, silent testimony to the industrial-scale cruelty of American slavery. Each collar was individually fitted, customized for maximum discomfort while allowing continued labor productivity. But even these permanent restraints paled in comparison to the practice of branding and deliberate mutilation. Marking human property. The smell of burning flesh hung in the air as Benjamin Farrar heated the iron brand bearing his initials. In 1806, on his Virginia plantation, he pressed the red-hot metal into the chest of an enslaved man named Sam, permanently marking him with B.F. The searing pain was intended to last minutes, but the scar would mark Sam as Farrar's property for life. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was standard practice across the American South. Court records from 1847 document the case of a man named Reuben branded on his face with the words, "A slave for life." The face branding wasn't just about identification, it was about permanent humiliation, ensuring that even if he escaped, his status would be immediately visible to any white person who saw him. Contemporary medical literature documented infection rates of 60 to 80% following branding procedures, with healing processes lasting 6 months to a year in constant pain. The procedures were performed without anesthesia, often by the same plantation physicians who treated wounds with salt brine to maximize suffering. But Louisiana Supreme Court records reveal that some plantation overseers went far beyond even these established practices of cruelty. The 1853 case Humphreys versus Oots involved an overseer who nailed a man's penis to a bedstead and then whipped him until he ripped his penis off the nail. The man, who was called Ginger Pop or Bob, was about 30 years old. He died shortly thereafter. The court's response was not to charge the overseer with murder, but to award civil damages to the plantation owner for property destruction. This case wasn't aberrational. It was simply the extreme end of a spectrum of systematic torture that characterized the American plantation system. But the most devastating punishments weren't always physical. The torture of the heart. Harriet Jacobs would never forget the night she witnessed the psychological dimension of plantation punishment. When I had been in the family a few weeks, one of the plantation slaves was brought to town. In that situation, he was to wait till the doctor had taken his tea. I shall never forget that night. His piteous groans and his "Oh, pray don't, massa," rang in my ear for months afterwards. The threat of family separation served as constant psychological torture that penetrated every aspect of enslaved life. About half of all enslaved children grew up apart from their fathers, while the constant threat of sale to sugar plantations, effectively death sentences, terrorized entire communities. Mount Vernon records document 47 escape attempts during George Washington's ownership, with chronic runaways sold to West Indies sugar plantations as ultimate punishment. This wasn't just about removing troublemakers, ND 25. It was about creating a climate of terror that would prevent future resistance. The psychology was devastatingly effective. Mothers watched their children playing, knowing they could be sold at any moment. Husbands worked alongside wives they might never see again after the next harvest. Love itself became a vulnerability that plantation owners exploited with surgical precision. But if the American South represented systematic cruelty, the Caribbean sugar plantations took that system to its absolute extreme. The Caribbean Laboratory of Death. In the sweltering heat of an 18th century Jamaica sugar plantation, Thomas Thistlewood sat in his study, meticulously recording the day's brutalities in his diary. Over 14,000 pages, preserved today at Yale University, document a level of systematic torture that defied human comprehension. Caribbean sugar plantations represented the pinnacle of plantation brutality, with mortality rates that often exceeded survival rates. The average lifespan on Caribbean sugar plantations was 7 to 9 years after arrival, compared to longer survival on tobacco or cotton plantations. This wasn't accident, it was calculated economics. It was cheaper to work people to death and buy replacements than to invest in their long-term survival. Thistlewood's papers provide unprecedented documentation of what he called Derby's dose, enslaved people forced to defecate in each other's mouths, held in place with gags for hours. He documented 3,852 acts of sexual violence against 138 enslaved women, alongside innovations like rubbing salt, pickle, lime juice, and bird pepper into whipping wounds. The sugar production process itself became weaponized for torture. Mills became instruments of deliberate mutilation, with enslaved people forced between crushing rollers or held near boiling sugar vats as punishment. The boiling house, with temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit, became a site of systematic torture through forced extended exposure. Harvest season intensified brutality beyond comprehension, and 18-hour workdays from mid-October through December, with entire populations, including young children and pregnant women, working around-the-clock shifts. Louisiana sugar plantations were the only United States plantations where death rates exceeded birth rates, requiring constant importation of new enslaved people. The numbers tell the story. 800,000 Africans were imported to Haiti alone, double the number brought to all of North America. This wasn't just about labor, it was about systematic destruction of human life on an industrial scale. Regional variations in systematic cruelty. While the Caribbean represented the extreme, each region of American slavery developed its own particular forms of systematic brutality, adapted to local crops and conditions. Deep South cotton plantations operated on quota systems that generated daily violence. William Wells Brown reported enslaved people required to pick 80 pounds of cotton daily, with one lash of the whip for each pound that they were short. The mathematics were simple and brutal, failed to meet impossible quotas, and faced calculated punishment. During harvest season from August to December, entire populations worked sunrise to sundown with children, pregnant women, and elderly people included. The gang system created opportunities for collective punishment, with entire work groups punished for individual shortfalls. South Carolina and Georgia low-country rice plantations used environmental conditions as punishment tools. Enslaved people were forced to work in alligator-infested swamps as punishment, while tidal flooding created opportunities for torture through controlled exposure during extreme weather. Virginia and Maryland tobacco plantations operated on 18-month crop cycles, creating prolonged punishment periods. Mount Vernon records document Charlotte, an enslaved seamstress, whipped with a hickory switch in 1793 for being impudent, punishment Washington deemed very proper. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the entire system was its medical dimension, USEI, the intersection of healing and torture that perverted the very concept of medical care. Medicine as torture. Dr. James Marion Sims performed up to 30 surgeries on individual enslaved women without anesthesia from 1845 to 1849, while plantation physicians prioritized maintaining slave productivity over healing. Sims, now controversially known as the father of modern gynecology, believed that African women didn't feel pain like white women, to be a convenient justification for his experimental procedures. Contemporary medical documentation reveals the calculated intersection of medicine and torture. Whipping injuries cause severe keloid scarring, permanent nerve damage, and muscle tissue destruction. Infection rates were deliberately maximized through unsanitary conditions and treatments designed to intensify suffering rather than promote healing. Iron collar injuries included severe neck and spine damage, chronic infections at pressure points, and respiratory complications. Medical records document cases of brain infections and severe neck injuries from prolonged collar use. Branding and mutilation procedures performed without anesthesia showed 40 to 60% mortality rates from surgical punishments. Contemporary physicians noted that procedures near vital organs frequently caused death, while infection rates were nearly universal due to deliberately unsanitary conditions. The most vulnerable populations faced particular horrors: the punishment of the powerless. Pregnant women received no protection from punishment, SP. Methods were adapted rather than suspended. Special techniques were developed for whipping pregnant women, including digging holes for their stomachs to lie in during punishment. Maternal mortality rates were 3 to 4 times higher than white women, with infant mortality at 50%. Children as young as 8 or 9 faced systematic punishment, Henrietta, King of Virginia, had her head held under a rocking chair while whipping, resulting in a crushed jawbone and permanent disfigurement, creating a false face. What children laugh at and babies gets to crying at. Elderly enslaved people faced reduced rations and medical care, with punishment methods often fatal due to reduced physical resilience. Medical records document abandonment when elderly people could no longer work productively. But even in the face of such systematic brutality, resistance never ceased. The psychology of terror and resistance. Punishment systems existed in constant tension with resistance, creating escalating cycles of violence. Public punishments served as community-wide psychological warfare. The 1811 German Coast Revolt saw dozens of slaves condemned to death, executed, and beheaded. Heads were planted on poles at places where each of them had undergone punishment. White spectators treated public punishments as entertainment, creating community-wide complicity in systematic torture. The Christmas Rebellion in Jamaica, from 1831 to 1832, saw 310 to 340 enslaved people judicially executed following the uprising, many for minor offenses like theft. Yet resistance continued. Every escape attempt, every act of defiance, every moment of maintained dignity represented a victory against a system designed to break the human spirit completely. Voices from the darkness. The 1930s Works Progress Administration Slave Narrative Project captured testimonies from over 2,300 formerly enslaved people, many describing punishments in vivid detail 70 years after emancipation. These voices, preserved against time, bear witness to systematic torture that generated enormous wealth while creating trauma lasting across generations. Walter Rim of Texas described systematic torture with devastating clarity. Master gets a bottle whiskey and a box cigars and have Tom tied up out in the yard. When there's 150 licks, it didn't look like there is any place left to hit, but Master say, finish him up. Court proceedings provide systematic documentation of punishment-related injuries and deaths. Alabama's Tillman versus Chadwick from 1861 involved a lawsuit over excessive punishment, while Louisiana Supreme Court records document multiple cases of torture-related deaths treated as property disputes rather than homicides. The Freedom on the Move database documents thousands of runaway slave advertisements describing punishment scars. Typical descriptions included easily frightened by the whip, large scar on the upper part of one of his wrists, and her back appears to have been used to the whip. These advertisements provide systematic documentation of punishment's permanent physical effects. The legacy of systematic torture. Modern research reveals that plantation punishment systems created lasting health disparities persisting today. Current black maternal mortality rates remain 3.5 times higher than white rates, while chronic diseases occur at double the rate in African American populations. Epigenetic research demonstrates trauma responses transmitted across generations. States with no prison wages today: Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, SEP, were sites of antebellum slave plantations. The 13th Amendment's exception for criminal punishment has perpetuated forced labor systems rooted in plantation precedents. This evidence reveals plantation punishment as a systematically organized institution serving multiple functions: labor control, psychological domination, economic efficiency, and racial hierarchy maintenance. The legal frameworks, medical complicity, regional variations, and documented individual cases provide comprehensive evidence of a system designed to extract maximum labor while maintaining psychological control through terror. The testimonies of survivors, preserved in slave narratives, court records, and historical documentation, to ensure these voices bear witness to systematic torture that generated enormous wealth for enslavers while creating trauma lasting across generations. As Frederick Douglass wrote, "Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, neither persons nor property will be safe." The plantation punishment system was not aberrational violence, but central to American slavery's economic and social structure, a machine designed to transform humans' suffering into profit. The evidence demands recognition of these systems as foundational to understanding American history, with legacies continuing in contemporary systems of racial control and economic exploitation. Only by confronting this history in its full brutality can we begin to understand how its effects continue to shape American society today. In the end, the most important truth about plantation punishment is not the catalog of specific tortures, but the systematic nature of a society that legally sanctioned, economically incentivized, and medically facilitated the torture of human beings on an industrial scale. That society's wealth was built on these foundations of systematic cruelty, and its effects echo still.